Hey there, survivors. Thanks for tuning into this story. If you're new here, please consider subscribing. It really helps me keep these stories coming. And while you're here, let me know in the comments where you're listening from. Now let's get started. My name is Riley Hart, former reporter for a local station that probably doesn't exist anymore. It's been a while since I found a safe spot to rest, and even longer since I've heard the buzz of a working radio. Now I rely on this battered cassette recorder to gather the voices of those left behind. The story I'm about to capture starts in an abandoned bus depot, hidden behind toppled fences and lonely streetlights that haven't glowed in months. Bailey, my four-legged companion, stays close. She's a good dog with a keen sense of danger, and her soft whine tells me she doesn't like this place. Broken windows, scattered luggage, and half-crushed metal benches line the depot. Pieces of old advertisements flutter against cracked walls, promising weekend getaways and holiday deals long cancelled by the end of the world. There's a hushed quiet here, broken only by the rasp of the wind over shattered glass. I picked my way through the clutter, searching for signs of life. This bus depot, once teeming with people hurriedly loading onto early morning routes, feels more like a relic of a bygone era. In the distance, I notice someone rummaging for scraps. It's a lone figure, half-shadowed by the collapsing roof. He moves carefully, as if each step might awaken something he'd rather let sleep. When I draw closer, I see he's bundled in a thick coat too large for his thin frame. Under a scruffy cap, he eyes me warily. Our world no longer has the luxuries of trust or courtesy, so I keep my hands visible, holding a small offering of food, dried fruit and crackers. I call out, voice echoing. Hey there, my name is Riley. I'm collecting stories. He eyes the tape recorder at my waist, then the food, and nods slowly. He motions me to a half-broken seat near the back of what used to be a loading zone, away from the wind. We exchange cautious greetings. He relaxes only after Bailey sits calmly beside me, tail curling over her paws. I learn his name is Jonah Reed, a former city bus driver. He was here when everything fell apart. After a bit of gentle coaxing and the promise of a decent meal in exchange, he agrees to share his tale. I press the record button. Static flickers across the tape. Bailey lets out a small huff, as if resigned to listening to another grim recollection of the end. Jonah looks older than he probably is. Deep lines mark his forehead, and his cheeks are hollow. His eyes dart left and right, and he keeps clearing his throat like it hurts to speak. He wears two mismatched gloves, one wool, one leather, and a patchy overcoat with a torn city bus emblem on the left sleeve. The rips and stains are evidence of close calls with the infected, but he doesn't mention them yet. He seems unsure whether words will help heal or just tear open new wounds. After a pause, he begins. I remember the day it all started, he says, rubbing his hands together for warmth. Back then, I had the overnight route, from the west side to downtown. In the beginning, the news called it isolated incidents. Just a few stories about folks acting strange. But people were on edge. Rumors spread. A sickness. Something that made people lose their sense of reality, turn aggressive. The city officials told everyone to go about their lives, not to panic. They thought it'd blow over. It didn't. He glances at the silent buses, each a metal husk lined up on ruined pavement. I've lived in this city all my life. I used to joke that the bus routes were in my blood, knew every street, every shortcut. But that night, the city didn't feel like home anymore. Jonah's voice grows quieter, as if recalling something he's tried to bury. It was late, maybe close to midnight. My route took me through downtown. Normally the roads are nearly empty at that hour, but I saw roadblocks, police lights flickering and people running. Some wore torn clothing, others limped, pale and unsteady. I radioed dispatch to ask what was going on. They had no clear explanation, told me to continue my shift and keep the passengers calm. So I did. He rubs his chin, where a sparse beard has grown. I picked up about 8 people, night shift workers, late travelers, a few who looked downright frightened. They begged me to drive them anywhere but downtown. Some said they'd seen fights break out. Others claimed people were biting. It sounded too wild to believe, but their faces told me they weren't making it up. Every few blocks we'd see more signs of trouble. Vehicles swerving, screams echoing from side streets. One man banged on the bus door, eyes wide with panic, shouting for help. I didn't want to let him on. My passengers were already scared. But I couldn't leave him out there, so I opened the doors. Jonah inhales sharply. That's when I caught a glimpse of the shadows behind him. Shapes moving at an unnatural gait. When I pulled him aboard, the shapes rushed forward, slamming against the side of the bus. People inside started screaming. That was the moment I realized this wasn't some rumor or localized riot. The city was tearing itself apart. I tried to calm everyone down. Jonah continues, his voice trembling at the memory. I told them we'd head straight to the nearest station, or maybe a hospital. I thought someone there would have answers or at least protective gear. But as we drove, the roads turned into chaos. Cars lay abandoned. Some were on fire. Others were stuck in collisions. With each block, more people waved us down, pleading for rescue. I'll never forget the faces pressed against the bus windows, begging to be let on. He looks down at his gloves. The worst part was having to drive past some of them. The bus was nearly full, and every extra person meant extra risk. The passengers cried out for me to keep driving. They didn't want to open the doors again, afraid the infected would slip in somehow. I felt like I was choosing who mattered and who didn't. I still hear them knocking, sometimes when I try to sleep. Jonah closes his eyes for a moment. Dispatch was no help. The line crackled with half-finished instructions, please, and finally silence. I took a detour, trying to find a route out of the city. The highway on-ramp was packed with vehicles. People had the same idea, escape at all costs. But the roads were jammed, and the infected were weaving through the cars, attacking anyone who ventured out. He licks his chapped lips. I decided to head back toward the central station, hoping it was still secure. As we got close, I saw the gates were slammed shut. The place was overrun. Stranded buses sat in lines. Some had windows smashed in from the inside. I knew we were on our own. When I tried to comfort the passengers, I realized fear had taken hold. They eyed each other with suspicion, wondering if someone might be hiding an injury. People huddled together, whispering about the end of days. The bus became an iron cage of terror. Every rattling signpost, every scrape of metal outside made everyone jump. He shudders. I locked the doors, told them to stay put while I looked around for a safe path. That's when an argument broke out. One passenger claimed another had been scratched. They yelled at each other, demanding I kick someone off. I refused, said we were all in this together, but the seed was planted, trust evaporated. Jonah's hands tighten on the edge of the seat. Not long after, a shriek cut through the bus. One of the passengers had collapsed near the back, feverish and incoherent. Another passenger insisted we leave them behind. A third pleaded that we find medicine. The entire group started shouting. There was pushing and shoving. The sick passenger rose, eyes glazed and unfocused. I knew we were in trouble. He swallows hard. I tried to restore order, but it was too late. Panic took over. People clambered to get off, only to find the doors jammed because I'd locked them for safety. They turned on me, demanding I open them. Meanwhile, the sick passenger stumbled forward, reaching out blindly. Someone swung an improvised weapon, a metal rod from the overhead rack, to protect themselves. The next thing I knew, it was chaos. Jonah grows silent for a few seconds, the memory pressing down on him. I finally managed to unlock the doors, but it was too late. People poured out, some screaming that the infected were right behind them. The city outside wasn't any safer. Smoke, broken glass, shadows in every alley. I stayed near the door, calling for calm, but no one listened. They scattered. He breathes unsteadily. I remember seeing a figure in the distance, someone who must have been infected, weaving from side to side. Then it sprinted toward us. A few people tried to board the bus again, but the creature followed them. A commotion erupted on the steps, and I knew I couldn't hold the bus. I jumped out the back exit and ran, letting it all fall behind me. The next few hours were a blur. I sneaked through deserted streets, avoiding the main roads. By the time I returned to the depot, I realized the city was lost. All around me I heard distant cries and saw flickers of strange silhouettes. I locked myself inside an abandoned employee office at the depot, hoping to wait it out. Days passed, but things only got worse. The infected roamed outside, and survivors, fearful, desperate, would do anything for supplies. Jonah's voice trembles again. Eventually the power grid failed. Cell towers went silent. The world I knew blinked off, just like that. Jonah gestures to the torn seats and graffiti on the depot walls. Now, I scavenge what I can from these old buses. Sometimes I find a can of food in a duffel bag someone left behind. Sometimes I find torn clothing, shoes, or a reminder of a happier time. I've survived on scraps and caution. Most people who pass through here are either too frightened to speak or too aggressive to trust. But I can't leave. This depot is familiar, and that's all I have left. He clears his throat, glancing at the nearest exit. I keep telling myself I'll get out of this city, but every time I try, I remember that night, the screams and the frantic pounding on the bus doors. It's like my soul is anchored here, forced to relive those final rides. I figure if I wait long enough, maybe help will come. Maybe it's foolish, but hope, no matter how thin, keeps me from losing my mind. I'm not proud of leaving people behind, he says, voice thick with emotion. But if I'd stayed, I'd be gone too. Sometimes I wonder if all of us have to become a little selfish to survive. That's the tragedy, you know. No matter how many people we saved or tried to save, it never felt like enough. He looks me in the eyes. You want to know how the world ended from my view? It ended the moment people stopped seeing each other as neighbors. We were just threats, or burdens, or infected. In those final days, we lost more than our cities. We lost our community. His hand shakes as he reaches for the small bag of dried fruit I offered him. He nods in gratitude, taking slow bites. Then he exhales a heavy breath, as if letting out the weight of a million regrets. He glances at Bailey, who wags her tail softly, and a faint, sad smile touches his lips. I stay with Jonah a little while longer, sharing what little supplies I can spare. Outside, the wind creeps through broken windows, carrying the faint smell of rust and damp concrete. The air grows colder, and I sense the night pressing in. Bailey huddles by my side, ears perked, alert to the lingering tension. Jonah's words echo in my mind, the memory of a bus crammed with terrified passengers, and the driver forced to decide who could stay and who must go. The thought is haunting. When the lines between safety and sacrifice blur, what parts of our humanity do we abandon? I walk through the depot, stepping around bent bicycle wheels and cracked vending machines. One machine stands open, its contents long gone. Posters on the walls show bright smiles, promising weekend getaways and scenic tours. They serve as hollow monuments to a world that believed such joys would last forever. Outside, I pause near a row of rusted buses. Their windows are gone, seats covered in debris and old newspapers. It's a silent graveyard of vehicles that once connected people to their homes, jobs, and families. Now they're just relics of a vanished society. I can almost imagine the hiss of the doors opening and the hum of an engine warming up. But the only sound is the distant moan of the wind as it drifts through steel shells. I think about how many stories I've collected. Each tape is a puzzle piece in the grand narrative of civilization's end. Some talk about the day the power grid failed. Others recall the moment official broadcasts stopped. Each perspective is different, yet they all point to the same truth. People clung to normalcy until normalcy was a memory. Then came the acceptance that what we once called civilization had slipped away. Bailey's soft muzzle nudges my hand. She senses my unease. Sometimes I wonder if I'm burdening her with all these human sorrows. But she stays loyal, watchful, a shield against the loneliness that follows me across these broken roads. As darkness gathers, I decide to set up a small camp in one of the more secure corners of the depot. Jonah remains in his makeshift shelter, a caged corner of the main office. He said I could stay if I wanted, but caution and habit make me keep my distance. Too many nights among strangers taught me that trust can be fragile. Still, I appreciate his hospitality. It's more than many survivors would offer. I light a small flame inside a metal drum, careful to keep the smoke from giving us away. The flicker of fire casts shadows dancing on the depot's walls, reminding me of ghosts. A faint drizzle taps against the broken rooftop. The gentle rhythm almost lulls me into forgetting the world outside. But the echo of Jonah's voice reminds me, we're all just one step away from being trapped, just like those passengers on the last bus out. I gather my thoughts and unspool a little cassette tape from my backpack. I always carry spares. Once I find a quiet moment, I'll record my own reflection. For now, I study the recorder in my hands, running my thumb over its worn buttons. These tapes have become my archives of the end, a testament for anyone who might come after us. If they do, they'll learn that the downfall wasn't just about the outbreak. It was about fear, panic, and the breakdown of empathy. I let out a heavy sigh. Bailey yawns, curling up at my feet. This is how we live now, setting up small camps in places once bustling with life, weaving through the ruins of a world we took for granted. Part of me wonders how it all seems so final. Another part holds on to hope that enough survivors remain to piece together something new. Jonah sleeps across the depot, or at least he tries to. I can hear him tossing on the floor, murmuring in the throes of a nightmare. He's likely reliving that last ride, remembering the screams, the pounding on the bus doors, the moment everything came undone. I close my eyes, feeling a twinge of empathy. This is our burden now, the memories that won't let go. It's well past midnight when I fully awaken to the sound of footsteps. My hand reaches instinctively for the small lantern. Bailey lifts her head, ears perked. The footsteps are slow, deliberate, moving just outside the depot's main entrance. I kill the lantern's light and hold my breath, heart thudding. We've had encounters with unfriendly survivors before, people who see a campfire as a chance to rob or worse. I carefully move to the edge of our makeshift camp. Jonah's silhouette flickers by a broken window, peering out. He's watching too. Through a crack in the plaster, I see a figure drifting among the scattered buses. They move jerkily, as if unsure of each step. Could be infected, could be delirious. In this world, both are equally dangerous. Bailey lets out a low rumble in her throat. I set a hand on her back, giving her a gentle hush. We don't want to attract attention. The figure wanders closer to the perimeter fence, pausing near an overturned sign. Then, with a heavy shuffle, they drift away into the dark. Their soft moans fade on the wind, swallowed by the night. We exhale, letting the tension slip. Once the footsteps vanish, I return to the warm glow of the metal drum fire. Jonah emerges from his corner, nodding at me. Our eyes meet in an unspoken understanding. We narrowly avoided a threat. Still, he looks shaken, haunted by what could have happened. He mentions that the infected sometimes wander in, drawn by old memories or random sounds. He's learned to hide, to keep quiet, to wait until they pass. There's no confrontation unless there's no other choice. I offer Jonah a few more dried foods. He accepts, carefully chewing. We share the quiet. Sometimes words only deepen the fear, so we let silence cradle us. Eventually he returns to his corner, pulling a ragged blanket over himself. I remain by the glowing embers, thinking about how easily that figure out there could have been me, or Jonah, or any of the countless survivors who didn't outrun the sickness. I stare at the cassette recorder, etched with scratches from my travels. Inside it, Jonah's testimony rests on a spool of magnetic tape. His experience is part of the tapestry I'm weaving. Each spool a puzzle piece revealing the collapse of our world. Though each story is unique, there's a common thread. Fear took hold faster than any sickness. People turned desperate in the face of uncertainty, and that desperation was the real spark that set everything ablaze. Bailey presses against my leg, seeking warmth. I scratch behind her ears. In the flicker of firelight, her eyes shine with steadfast loyalty. She's been with me through thick and thin, never questioning my quest to collect these stories. If anything, she provides a sense of normalcy in a realm that's anything but normal now. Across the depot, Jonah's breathing eventually steadies. Mine does too. The darkness feels endless, but eventually a faint glow of dawn will break over the horizon. Whether it brings safety or new horrors, I can't say. All I can do is preserve these voices, one tape at a time. A dim grey light filters through cracks in the roof. Night's chill lifts slightly, though it leaves a dampness in the air. I stretch, jostling stiff joints. Bailey sniffs around, keeping watch as I pack up my small camp. Jonah stirs, rubbing his eyes. He looks at me, seeming reluctant to let a visitor leave. I approach him. "I'm moving on," I say gently. "More stories to record." He nods, though I see a flicker of sadness in his gaze. I understand. Company is rare, and we're both starved for a connection that doesn't bring danger. "Take care," I add, pressing a can of food into his hand. "You too," Jonah replies, voice quieter than before. He looks around the depot, then back at me. "If you come by again, I might not be here, but I hope I make it out somehow." I pause, uncertain what to say. There's no guarantee for anyone's survival, but a small part of me wants to believe he'll find a better place. I settle for a nod and a subdued smile. Bailey wags her tail once, as if bidding him farewell. I step out into the city streets, or what's left of them. Broken streetlights, scattered trash, and hollowed-out cars form a trail of urban debris. Bailey and I stick to the edges, weaving around collapsed buildings and burnt storefronts. The city's skyline looms overhead, jagged and grim. It's a constant reminder that everything familiar can crumble in an instant. As we leave the bus depot behind, my thoughts remain with Jonah, still replaying that final ride in my mind. I can almost hear the rumble of the engine, see the anxious faces in the rearview mirror, and feel the weight of the doors slamming shut. In that cramped space, fear grew like a flame. It consumed them from the inside out, long before the infected ever reached the bus. This is Riley Hart, continuing the archive. Tape 7, The Last Bus Out, contains the testimony of Jonah Reed, a city bus driver who bore witness to the early hours of the city's collapse. His story illustrates how quickly trust erodes when survival becomes uncertain. People crowded onto that bus, hoping it would carry them away from the nightmare. Instead, they carried the nightmare with them. Fear can turn an enclosed space into a cage, pitting passengers against one another. There's a lesson in that. In these tapes, I'm learning that it wasn't just a contagion that broke us. It was panic. I click the recorder off, letting the weight of the words settle. Bailey looks up at me, tail wagging gently. I give her a reassuring pat and resume walking. We still have miles to cover, new survivors to find, and stories left untold. In a world without normalcy, I cling to the belief that documenting these voices matters. Our path leads us past a neighborhood of modest houses. Windows are boarded, some doors forced open. Old holiday lights still hang from the roof lines, swaying in the breeze. The roads here are silent. Now and then I spot footprints in the dust. Could be infected, could be survivors. At each intersection I pause, scanning for movement. A single crow perches on a mailbox, watching us with dark eyes. Bailey's ears twitch, but the bird makes no move. It lets out a dry caw, echoing through the deserted streets. I'm reminded of how quickly nature reclaims what humanity leaves behind. The outbreak accelerated that process, leaving entire neighborhoods abandoned to the elements. Rounding a corner, we come upon a lone figure picking through trash bins. Unlike Jonah, this person wears several layers of mismatched clothing, a scarf wrapped tight around the face. I raise a hand in greeting. They give me a wary glance before ducking down an alley, not wanting to chance an interaction. It's the way of things now, survival before courtesy. I understand their caution but feel a pang of isolation. Once upon a time we'd stop to chat about the weather, about our favorite local sports team, or about weekend plans. Now we exchange suspicious glances and carry on. As midday approaches, I find an old convenience store that looks structurally sound. Bailey and I slip inside, stepping over shattered glass. The shelves are ransacked, of course, but I manage to find a couple of plastic bottles that can hold water. I also discover some batteries. Lucky, since the cassette recorder drains them faster than I'd like. I sit on the floor, rummaging through my pack. The hum of tape reels in my head as I think of Jonah's words. We lost more than our cities. We lost our community. It feels hauntingly accurate. Each day I meet people who clutch at survival with desperation, but have forgotten how to connect. Fear has overshadowed kindness. Before leaving, I write a small note on the back of a food wrapper and tack it to the wall. If you find this store and need shelter, be quiet and check for infected first, then rest. It's a small gesture of goodwill, though I wonder if anyone will see it. Stepping outside again, I can't help but remember my old routine. I used to chase headlines, covering city council meetings or local festivals. My biggest worries were deadlines and whether my broadcast packages had enough dramatic flair. Now I worry if each step I take might lead me into danger. Reflecting on that, I realize how trivial my old concerns were. The city around me stands in silent testimony to how quickly a society can fall. Streets that once bustled with kids heading to school or workers catching the morning bus are now deserted. The only signs of life are fleeting silhouettes in the distance, neither fully friend nor foe. I keep moving, guided by the faint hope that someone, somewhere has a plan for a fresh start. As the sun dips low, I find a sheltered area beneath a downed billboard. I pull out my recorder again to add a final note about Jonah. He's a symbol of how an ordinary person becomes an accidental witness to history. Driving a bus seemed like routine work, but in the collapse, that routine turned into a front row seat for the unraveling of civilization. Jonah fought to protect his passengers, yet in the end, the greatest threat wasn't just the infected outside. It was the panic inside. If you're listening to this someday, remember, we unravel from within long before we're overwhelmed from without. Bailey lies down, resting her muzzle on her paws. She's earned a break after the day's walk. I take a moment to feel the gentle breeze on my face, grateful we made it another day without trouble. In the distance, I spot the dark outlines of tall buildings, their upper floors lost in the evening sky. Tomorrow I'll head closer to the city center in search of more survivors. The voice in my head asks if there's a point to it, if anything can change. But I push that thought away. Documenting these stories is my purpose, one of the last meaningful roles I can cling to. The final rays of sunlight stretch across the skyline, painting it in deep purples and oranges. I watch as night envelops the ruins. Each time the sun sets, I'm reminded of how easily darkness can settle over everything we once held dear. But even in the dark, I keep the tapes safe, pressing them against my chest, as if they're precious heirlooms. Their content might be the only record of how we fell and how we tried to stand again. I close my eyes, letting the hush of the evening lull me. Distant echoes, perhaps the wind, perhaps something else, drift through the abandoned streets. Tomorrow will bring more uncertainty. But for tonight, I've done what I can. I've preserved Jonah's testimony, and in doing so, I've carried a piece of our collective memory forward. This concludes Tape 7, The Last Bus Out. The account of Jonah Reed will stand as a reminder that not all tragedies hinge on monstrous creatures or destructive forces. Sometimes, the worst horrors are born out of ordinary people trapped in extraordinary circumstances. Fear is a powerful catalyst, turning compassion into suspicion, neighbors into strangers. On that final bus ride, passengers sought safety, but found only terror when trust dissolved. May we remember Jonah's story as we attempt to rebuild, or at least endure. This is Riley Hart, signing off for now. If anyone out there finds these tapes, know that our world didn't fall solely because of a zombie outbreak. It fell because we forgot to hold on to each other when it mattered most. Thank you for listening. If this story sent shivers down your spine, don't forget to like and subscribe for more unsettling creepypastas. Your support keeps this channel alive. Until next time, stay vigilant and remember, curiosity can be quite the companion, and sometimes a curse.